The survey ship Luminous Theory had been drifting through the Orion Spur for nearly 3 standard cycles when its sensors detected something that would change the galaxy forever. Captain Yethral of the Valori species stood before the main display screen, his bioluminescent skin flickering with patterns of curiosity and mild disgust as the data scrolled past his compound eyes. "This cannot be accurate," he said to his science officer, a tall being named Kenthra, whose light patterns showed similar disbelief. The planet on the screen was a nightmare-given format. Was the third world orbiting a yellow star in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy, and everything about it seemed designed to kill anything foolish enough to exist there. The atmospheric readings showed a toxic mixture of nitrogen and oxygen, with the oxygen levels high enough to make fires spread with terrifying speed across the surface water. That universal solvent that could dissolve almost anything given enough time fell from the sky in massive quantities and covered nearly 70% of the planet's surface. The axial tilt created something the inhabitants apparently called seasons, where temperatures could swing by dozens of degrees within a single orbital cycle. Massive storms capable of leveling cities formed regularly over the warm oceans. The ground itself was unstable, with enormous plates of rock grinding against each other and creating devastating earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. And somehow, impossibly, intelligent life had evolved there. "Run the biological scans again," Captain Yethral ordered. Kenthra complied, and the results were even more disturbing than the planetary data. The dominant species was a bizarre bipedal creature that had apparently risen to sapience despite being one of the most fragile organisms on their world. They had no natural armor, no venomous defenses, no claws worth mentioning, and pathetically weak senses compared to the predators they shared their world with. Yet somehow these soft, vulnerable creatures had not only survived, but had conquered their entire planet. They had done so through methods that made Yethral's bioluminescence shift to the pale blue of deep unease. These humans, as they called themselves, were persistence predators. They had hunted creatures many times their size by simply following them until the prey collapsed from exhaustion. Their bodies could regulate temperature through sweating, allowing them to remain active in heat that would incapacitate other species. They healed from injuries that would kill most beings, their bones knitting back together and their flesh regenerating over wounds that should have been fatal. And perhaps most disturbing of all, they had spent most of their history as a sapient species perfecting ways to kill each other. The Luminous Theory spent 3 months observing from a safe distance, cataloging human radio transmissions and studying their civilization. What Captain Yethral found made him increasingly certain that these creatures needed to be contained. They had split the atom and used it to destroy 2 of their own cities. They had created chemical weapons capable of melting flesh from bone. They had developed biological agents that could wipe out entire populations. They had done all of this to members of their own species, and yet they had also created art of breathtaking beauty, music that even alien ears could appreciate, and literature that explored the deepest questions of existence. They loved fiercely and mourned deeply and showed kindness to strangers, even as they waged war against their neighbors. They were a contradiction, a species that should not exist. And Yethral knew the Galactic Concord needed to be warned. The Council of Voices convened 6 months after the Luminous Theory returned with its report. The Great Chamber on the Concord homeworld of Thessaly Prime filled with representatives from over 200 species, their translator implants humming as they processed the data from the survey. Mission Ambassador Thrankith of the Valori stood at the central podium, his bioluminescent patterns projecting calm authority as he addressed the assembly. "Fellow members of the Concord," he began, What we have discovered in the Orion Spur represents a potential threat, unlike anything we have encountered in the 12,000 years of our coalition's existence. He gestured, and holographic images of Earth appeared above the assembly gasps, and murmurs rippled through the chamber as delegates saw the hurricanes, the earthquakes, the volcanic eruptions, and the creatures that had evolved alongside the humans. This is what we call a Category 5 Deathworld. Threnkith continued, the most extreme classification in our survey protocols. And this, he said, changing the display to show human beings, is what evolved there. Laughter began to spread through the chamber. The Kethver delegate, a massive reptilian being with scales the color of dried blood, made a dismissive gesture with his clawed hand. These are the terrifying Deathworlders, he asked, his translator rendering his contempt clearly. They look like prey animals. Their military history suggests otherwise, Threnkith replied. But his voice was drowned out by more laughter. The Morthic representative, a stocky being with 4 arms and gray skin like polished stone, shook his head in what passed for amusement among his kind. Every few centuries we discover another Deathworld species, he said. And it is always the same story. They are violent, unstable, incapable of the cooperation required for interstellar civilization, agreed the delegate from the Shen, her aquatic form shimmering in her mobility tank. Threnkith tried to continue his presentation, but the mood of the chamber had shifted from concern to amusement. These humans were clearly too primitive and too self-destructive to pose any real threat. They had not even achieved faster than light travel, yet by the time they did, if they did not destroy themselves first, the Concord would have millennia to prepare. The vote was nearly unanimous. Humanity would be quarantined, observed from a distance, and studied as a curiosity. Research stations would monitor their radio transmissions and track their technological development if they somehow managed to develop interstellar capability. The Concord would reassess. Until then, they would be left alone to either mature into a civilized species or destroy themselves, as so many Deathworld cultures had done before. Ambassador Threnkith cast the deciding vote in favor of the quarantine, his bioluminescence showing the confident blue of certainty. These humans were fascinating, certainly, but they were no threat to a civilization that had endured for 12,000 years. The Deathworld myths were just that. Myths. Stories told to frighten young beings. Cautionary tales about the dangers of hostile evolution. Real civilizations were built on cooperation and stability, not violence and chaos. As the delegates filed out of the chamber, already forgetting about the strange bipedal creatures from the Orion Spur, none of them could have imagined how wrong they were. Of them could have known that the laughter echoing through the council chamber would one day turn to screams, and none of them understood the most important truth about humanity, that a species forged in the fires of a Deathworld does not break when faced with adversity. It adapts, it overcomes, and it remembers those who underestimated it. News of the Kethver defeat spread across the galaxy like wildfire through dry grass. The survivors of the invasion fleet had fled to every corner of known space, their ships damaged and their crews traumatized. And everywhere they went, they told the same story. The Deathworld species had fought back, and they had one ambassador. Threnkith stood in his private chambers on Thessaly Prime, watching the reports scroll across his display with a growing sense of dread. His bioluminescence had shifted to the pale, sickly shade of fear, and he could not seem to make it change. No matter how hard he tried, the images from the battle were being analyzed by every military power in the Concord. Human weapons were being studied, and dissected human tactics were being debated and discussed, and everywhere the same question was being asked. What do we do now? The Kethver hegemony demanded immediate action. Their ambassador, a scarred veteran named Croshful, who had lost 3 siblings in the human system, stood before the Council of Voices and called for a coalition war. "These primitives have murdered 12,000 HFY warriors," he roared, his scales flushing with the crimson of rage. "They have destroyed ships that took decades to build. They have humiliated the greatest military power in the galaxy. This cannot stand." The council chamber erupted in chaos. Some delegates supported the HFY call for vengeance. Others argued for caution, pointing out that the humans had demonstrated capabilities far beyond what the survey reports had predicted. A few quietly suggested that perhaps the Concord should simply leave the humans alone and hope they did not expand beyond their home system. Thren Keth watched the debate with a heavy heart. He had been among those who laughed at the Deathworld species. Just 2 years ago he had voted for the quarantine, confident that the humans would either destroy themselves or remain a minor curiosity. Now he was no longer sure of anything. The debate raged for months. The HFY demanded war, the Valori counseled patience, the Morthok wanted to wait and see, and while the galaxy argued, humanity was not sitting idle. The first signs came from the observation posts that had been established to monitor human development. Their signals stopped coming when the Concord sent ships to investigate. They found the stations destroyed, their crews missing, and their data cores wiped clean. Then came the reports from the border region ships had been seen. Ugly vessels with sharp angles and bristling weapons, moving through systems that had never seen human presence before. They were not attacking, not yet. But they were watching, and they were making contact. The Morthok were the first to respond to human overtures. Their homeworld had been strip-mined by the Valori centuries ago. Their people reduced to indentured laborers in asteroid processing facilities across the galaxy. When human diplomats offered them an alliance, offered them weapons and technology and the chance to reclaim their dignity, they accepted without hesitation. The Shen were next. Aquatic species had nearly been driven to extinction by HFY expansion. Their ocean worlds drained and converted to farming colonies. The survivors lived in cramped tanks on space stations, dreaming of waters they would never swim again. Humanity offered them hope. And hope was something they had not felt in generations. Word spread through the galaxy's underclass, through the conquered and the exploited and the forgotten. Deathworld species was building something. They were forming a coalition of their own, and they were offering a simple bargain. Join us, and we will protect you. By the time the Concord finally voted to authorize military intervention, the strategic situation had changed completely. Human fleet had grown from a handful of captured HFY vessels to over 300 warships of their own design. Human engineers had reverse-engineered alien technology and improved upon it in ways that made Concord scientists question everything they thought they knew about physics. Human soldiers had been training for years, drilling in conditions that would kill members of other species, preparing for a war they knew was coming, and humanity was no longer alone. The Terran Coalition announced its existence in a broadcast that reached every inhabited system in the galaxy. Simultaneously, 18 species stood united. Under human leadership, the Morthok had contributed their expertise in mining and construction, building shipyards that could produce warships faster than anyone had thought possible. The Shen had provided their knowledge of fluid dynamics and underwater combat, helping design weapons and tactics that the Concord had never imagined. A dozen other species had brought their own gifts: intelligence networks, scientific knowledge, industrial capacity, and a burning desire for revenge against those who had oppressed them. Admiral James Chun, great-grandson of the sergeant who had killed Supreme Commander Vethral, stood on the bridge of the Coalition flagship, unconquered, and addressed the galaxy. His voice was calm and measured, carrying no trace of the rage that burned in his heart. but every word landed like a hammer blow. The Galactic Concord chose to quarantine humanity, he said. They laughed at us and called us primitive. They believed we would destroy ourselves or fade into irrelevance. They were wrong. The HFY hegemony chose to attack us without provocation. They believed we would surrender or die. They were wrong. Now the Concord prepares for war against us. They believe they can crush us with superior numbers and ancient technology. They are wrong. Did not ask for this conflict. We did not seek to impose ourselves upon the galaxy. But we will not be conquered. We will not be enslaved, and we will not be ignored. To our allies, we say, stand with us. And we will stand with you until the stars burn out. To our enemies, we say, you had your chance to leave us in peace. That chance is gone. The transmission ended, and across the galaxy, beings of every species felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. The Deathworld species had stopped laughing, and now the war would truly begin. The hegemony of HFY had never signed the Galactic Concord's treaties. They saw no need to for 3,000 years. Their empire had expanded across 40 star systems, conquering every species they encountered and bending them to serve the glory of the hegemony. The HFY were apex predators from a world of dense jungles and endless competition. They stood over 2 meters tall, their bodies covered in scales that could deflect most projectile weapons, their claws capable of tearing through metal. They had evolved to dominate. And dominate they did. Supreme Commander Vethral stood on the bridge of the dreadnought Eternal Dominion, watching the blue and green planet growing larger in the view screen. His fleet of 500 warships had dropped out of hyperspace, just beyond the orbit of the 4th planet, giving the primitive inhabitants of the 3rd world plenty of time to see what was coming for them. Begin broadcasting the standard ultimatum, Vethral ordered. His voice a deep rumble that made his subordinates stand straighter in fear and respect. The communications officer complied, and soon the message was transmitting on every frequency the humans used. The translation was simple: surrender your world, submit to neural collaring, and serve the hegemony, or be reduced to radioactive ash. Vethral had delivered this ultimatum to 17 different species. 15 had surrendered immediately, 2 had fought and been destroyed. He expected the humans to fall into the first category. The intelligence reports from Concord observation posts had been clear. These were primitive creatures who had not yet developed faster than light travel. Their weapons were chemical propellants and crude nuclear devices. They posed no threat to a proper military force. The first response came within the hour. It was not a surrender. Vethral stared at the message, his scales shifting to the darker shade that indicated anger among his kind. The humans had replied with a single phrase that his translator struggled to render properly. The closest approximation was, "Come and take it, arrogant prey animals," Vethral snarled. Begin the approach. Advance the fleet. His warships moved forward in perfect formation. 5 centuries of conquest having refined their tactics to an art form, the lead vessels crossed the orbit of the 4th planet, then the asteroid belt, then the orbit of the red planet the humans called Mars. They were halfway between Mars and Earth when the first projectiles hit. There was no warning. One moment the HFY fleet was advancing in triumph. The next moment, the forward screening vessels were exploding. Vethral watched in disbelief as 6 ships vanished in fireballs that outshone the local star. Report, he demanded. What hit us? The tactical officer's claws were shaking as she examined her displays. Kinetic projectiles, Supreme Commander, she said, launched from the surface of the 3rd world. Railguns of some kind. They accelerated masses of metal to nearly 3% of light speed. Our shields could not stop them. Vethril felt something he had not experienced since his youth. Since before he had become the most feared commander in the hegemony, he felt uncertain. "Return fire," he ordered. "Launch fighters. Show these creatures the price of defiance." The Kethvar fleet responded with overwhelming force energy weapons lanced out toward the human planet. Fighters screamed from launch bays, and missile batteries unleashed salvos that should have been enough to crack the world's crust. But the humans were not done from hidden bases across their world, from platforms orbiting their moon, from ships that had been disguised as civilian satellites. A second wave of projectiles launched. These were different from the first. They were not simple kinetic rounds, but complex weapons that split into dozens of warheads, each one seeking a different target. They carried nuclear charges that detonated against Kethvar shields, overwhelming them through sheer numbers. They released clouds of metallic fragments that shredded sensor arrays and communication dishes, and some of them were not weapons at all, but boarding pods filled with human soldiers in armored suits. Vethril watched his tactical display with growing horror as red icons began appearing throughout his fleet. The humans were not just defending their world, they were counterattacking. Reports flooded in from across the formation. Human soldiers had breached the hull of the carrier Vengeance Absolute and were fighting their way toward the reactor Korea. Swarm of human missiles had taken out the engines of the battlecruiser Pride of Kethvar, leaving it drifting and helpless. Two destroyers had collided after their navigation systems were compromised by some kind of electronic attack, and still the kinetic rounds kept coming, each one traveling too fast to intercept, each one carrying enough energy to gut a warship 6 hours after the battle began. The flagship Eternal Dominion was alone. 500 warships had entered the human system. Fewer than 50 remained combat-capable, and most of those were fleeing at maximum speed toward the hyperlimit. Veril stood on his shattered bridge, surrounded by the bodies of his officers, and watched as human assault craft approached his crippled vessel. He had never surrendered in his life. He had never imagined a scenario in which surrender would be necessary. But as the airlock alarms began to sound, and his guards took up defensive positions, he realized that everything he thought he knew about warfare had been wrong. The humans did not fight like a civilized species. They did not follow the unwritten rules that govern conflict between starfaring peoples. They fought like they were still on their Deathworld, like every battle was a fight for survival, like losing was not an option they were willing to consider. The boarding action was brutal, and short human marines moved through the corridors of the Eternal Dominion with a speed and aggression that caught even veteran Kethvar warriors off guard. They worked in small teams, covering each other with precise fire, throwing grenades around corners, never stopping to celebrate victories or mourn losses. A human sergeant named Sarah Chun led the team that reached the bridge. She was small by human standards, barely reaching the chest of the Kethvar warriors she fought, but she moved with a fluid deadliness that made her seem much larger when she faced Supreme Commander Vethril in single combat. He towered over her by nearly a full meter. He outweighed her by at least 100 kilograms. His claws could have torn her in half with a single swipe. The fight lasted less than 30 seconds. Chun exploited every weakness in his stance, every gap in his guard, every moment of hesitation. She broke his arm at the elbow, shattered his knee with a precisely aimed kick, and drove her combat knife through the gap between his throat scales before he could land a single blow. As the light faded from his eyes, Vethril understood the truth that the Galactic Concord had failed to grasp. These humans were not prey animals. They were predators wearing the skin of prey, and they had just announced their presence to a galaxy that was utterly unprepared for what was coming. The Concord combined fleet assembled at the staging point in the Thessaly system. and for a brief moment, it seemed like nothing in the galaxy could stand against such a force. 2,000 warships from 15 different species hung in the void like a constellation of Death Valerie cruisers with their elegant lines and powerful energy. Weapons Skethver dreadnoughts rebuilt and reinforced after the disaster at Earthmorthic. Vessels that had been seized when that species joined the human coalition ships from a dozen other members of the Concord, each one representing centuries of technological development and military tradition. Fleet Admiral Yentris of the Valori looked upon his armada and felt confidence radiating through his bioluminescent skin. The humans had won a single battle against an overconfident enemy. This would be different. This would be overwhelming force applied with precision and discipline. This would be the end of the Deathworld threat. Set course for the Sol System, he ordered. Maximum speed. We end this today. The fleet entered hyperspace and across the galaxy. Billions of beings held their breath. No one knew exactly what would happen when the full might of galactic civilization met the upstart humans, but everyone understood that the outcome would shape the future of every species in known space. The coalition was waiting for. The Admiral Chun had studied every piece of intelligence his people could gather about Concord tactics and technology. He knew their ships were faster in hyperspace. He knew their weapons had greater range. He knew their shields were more efficient, and he knew none of that would matter if he could change the rules of the engagement. The Concord fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Sol System, exactly where coalition intelligence had predicted they would appear. They found themselves in a minefield, not a conventional minefield of explosive devices and proximity sensors. Something far worse. Human engineers had spent 3 years seeding the outer system with autonomous weapons platforms disguised as asteroids and comets. When the Concord fleet arrived, over 10,000 of these platforms activated simultaneously. They fired everything they had: kinetic rounds, nuclear missiles, electromagnetic pulses, sensor-jamming chaff, and things the Concord had never encountered before. Chemical weapons that ate through hull plating, biological agents engineered to attack the specific physiologies of different Concord species, nozzle machines that infiltrated computer systems and caused catastrophic failures. The first hour of the battle cost the Concord 300 ships without a single coalition vessel engaging directly. Admiral Yentris watched his beautiful formation disintegrate into chaos and felt his confidence crumbling. All ships advance through the minefield, he ordered. Find the enemy fleet and destroy it. The Concord pushed forward, absorbing losses that would have broken any ordinary military force. Their discipline held even as ships exploded around them. Their crews fought on even as they died. After 6 hours of grinding through the outer system, they finally engaged the coalition fleet in direct combat, and that was when they discovered the true horror of human warfare. Coalition ships did not fight like civilized vessels. They did not exchange fire at long range and maneuver for advantage. They charged directly at Concord formations, closing to point-blank range where their crude but powerful weapons could do maximum damage. Human pilots flew with a recklessness that bordered on insanity, accepting hits that would have forced any rational being to withdraw, pressing attacks that should have been suicidal. And they won, not because their ships were better, not because their weapons were stronger, but because they simply would not stop. The Lara cruiser disabled a human destroyer, tearing away its engines and weapons with precise fire. Destroyer's crew did not surrender or await rescue. They overloaded their reactor and rammed the cruiser at maximum acceleration, destroying both ships. A Kethver boarding team seized control of a coalition frigate, killing most of its crew and preparing to use it against its former allies. The frigate's captain, wounded and trapped on the bridge, triggered the self-destruct rather than let her ship be used against her people across the battlefield. Similar stories played out human crews dying rather than surrendering, human ships fighting until they were literally falling apart, human soldiers holding positions long past the point where any sane being would have retreated. Admiral Yentris ordered his fleet to fall back and regroup. They had lost nearly 1,000 ships. The coalition had lost perhaps half that number by any conventional measure. The Concorde was still winning, but Yentris could see what the numbers did not show. His crews were shaken. They had never faced an enemy like this. They had never imagined that any species could fight with such complete disregard for their own survival, and the humans were not done. On the 6th day of the battle, a flotilla of converted cargo haulers dropped out of hyperspace behind the Concorde formation. They carried no weapons that any sensor could detect. They carried only rocks, thousands of tons of nickel-iron asteroids, each one accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed before being released. The kinetic barrage hit the Concorde fleet like the fist of an angry god. Ships that had weathered hours of combat were torn apart in seconds. Admiral Yentris felt his flagship shudder as fragments peppered its hull. And for the first time in his long career, he understood that he might lose. The battle raged for 3 more days. The Concorde fleet, once 2,000 strong, dwindled to less than 500 combat-capable vessels. Coalition losses were severe, but their shipyards kept producing replacements, and their allies kept sending reinforcements. On the 8th day, human marines boarded the Concorde flagship. Admiral Yentris met them on the bridge with a ceremonial blade in his hand. Determined to die with honor, the human who killed him was a young lieutenant who had already lost an arm in the fighting. She shot him twice in the chest with a projectile weapon, stepped over his body, and moved on to secure the rest of the ship. On the 9th day, the Concorde fleet surrendered. The survivors were allowed to withdraw, carrying with them the knowledge that the galaxy had changed forever. The Deathworld species had won, and nothing would ever be the same. Ambassador Threnkith could not sleep. 3 months had passed since the Treaty of Ganymede, and the galaxy was slowly adjusting to its new reality. Trade routes were being redrawn, diplomatic relationships were being renegotiated. The old certainties that had governed interstellar civilization for millennia were crumbling, and no one knew what would replace them. But none of that was what kept Threnkith awake in his darkened chambers. What haunted him was a question he could not stop asking himself. How had the Concorde been so wrong about the humans he had spent his entire career studying alien species? He had believed he understood the patterns of galactic civilization, the rules that governed the rise and fall of interstellar powers, and he had been utterly, catastrophically mistaken. The humans should not have won. Every model, every analysis, every historical precedent suggested that a species at their level of development could not defeat a coalition of established powers. They had been outnumbered. Their technology had been inferior. They had faced enemies with thousands of years of experience in interstellar warfare, and yet they had triumphed. Renthage needed to understand why. He requested a meeting with Dr. Sarah Chun, and to his surprise, she agreed immediately. They met on neutral ground, a space station orbiting a gas giant in the Vel system. The ambassador arrived first, his bioluminescence carefully controlled to project calm confidence. But when Dr. Chen entered the meeting room, he found himself struggling to maintain that facade. She was smaller than he had expected. This human, who had helped negotiate the end of galactic civilization, as he knew it, her dark hair was streaked with gray, and her face showed the lines of someone who had known great stress, but her eyes were sharp and clear. And when she looked at him, Threnkith felt as if she was seeing straight through his diplomatic mask. "You wanted to ask me something," she said, taking a seat across from him without any of the formal greetings his species normally expected. "You have been very patient with our curiosity about your people." Threnkith's light flickered with surprise at her directness. "I have been patient because I believe understanding is the foundation of peace," he replied. "But yes, there are things I need to understand. How did you do it? How did your species accomplish what should have been impossible?" Dr. Chun was quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "What specifically are you asking about?" she said. "The war, the technology, something else, all of it," Threnkith said, his careful control slipping as the words tumbled out. "We studied your world. We saw that it was trying to kill you every moment of every day. We assumed that any species that evolved in such conditions would be violent, unstable, incapable of cooperation. And you were violent. You had spent centuries developing weapons to kill each other. But you also built civilizations that spanned your world. You created art and music and literature. You developed science and philosophy and law. You were contradictions. And we did not understand you. We still do not understand you." Dr. Chun nodded slowly. "You are not the first to say that," she said. "In truth, we do not always understand ourselves. But I can try to explain what I have observed." She leaned forward, her eyes meeting his. "You said our world was trying to kill us," she continued. "That is true. But what you fail to understand is that we did not survive despite our world. We survived because of it. Every disaster taught us to prepare for the next one. Every predator taught us to hunt and defend ourselves. Every disease taught us to study the world around us and bend it to our will. Our planet did not make us weak. It made us adaptable." Threnkith's bioluminescence shifted to the color of deep concentration. "But adaptability alone does not explain your victory," he said. "Many species can adapt. Few can fight a war against overwhelming odds and win." "True," Dr. Chun agreed. "Adaptability is not enough. You also need something else. Something my people have in abundance." "What is that?" Dr. Chun smiled. But there was something hard in it. Something that made Threnkith's instincts scream warnings, even as his conscious mind told him there was no threat. "We call it spite," she said. "The refusal to give up even when giving up would be the rational choice. The determination to keep fighting even when victory seems impossible. The willingness to sacrifice everything rather than submit. It is not a noble quality. It is not something we are proud of, but it is deeply woven into what we are as a species. When your Concord voted to quarantine us, when your fleets came to conquer us, you were counting on us to behave rationally. You expected us to calculate the odds and choose submission over destruction. But we are not rational. Not when our survival is at stake. We would rather die than kneel. And because of that, you could not defeat us." Threnkith sat in silence, processing what he had heard his species prize rationality above all else. Their entire civilization was built on careful calculation and measured responses. The idea that a species could succeed through sheer irrational determination was alien to everything he believed. "That is terrifying," he said. Finally, Dor Chen's smile softened. "Yes," she said, "it is. But consider this. That same quality that made us impossible to conquer also makes us impossible to break. We will stand by our allies, no matter the cost. We will honor our commitments, no matter the sacrifice. We will never stop fighting for what we believe in. You can call that terrifying if you wish. We call it being human." Threnkith left the meeting with more questions than answers. But for the first time since the war began, he felt something that might have been hope. The humans were not predictable, they were not safe, but they kept their word. And they protected their friends, and in a galaxy full of danger and uncertainty, perhaps that was enough. The guns fell silent over the Sol system, but the echoes of battle continued to reverberate across the galaxy. Debris fields stretched for millions of kilometers. The graves of thousands of ships and millions of beings, rescue operations continued for weeks as both sides recovered survivors from shattered hulls and drifting escape pods. Admiral Chun stood on the observation deck of the Unconquered, watching the cleanup efforts with tired eyes. The coalition had won, but the cost had been staggering. Nearly half of his fleet had been destroyed or crippled. Hundreds of thousands of human soldiers and sailors had died. The allied species had suffered proportionally worse, their smaller populations feeling each loss more deeply, and the war was not truly over. The Concord had been defeated in this battle, but they still controlled vast territories and commanded resources far beyond what the coalition could match if they chose to continue fighting. The conflict could drag on for decades. Chun knew that his people needed time to recover and rebuild. He also knew that time was something they might not have. The diplomatic initiatives began even before the last fires were extinguished. Coalition representatives reached out to every species in the Concord, offering terms that were surprisingly generous given the circumstances. There would be no demands for territory or tribute, no requirements for submission or humiliation. The coalition wanted only three things: recognition as equals, protection for member species, and an end to the exploitation that had characterized galactic civilization for millennia. Ambassador Thren Keth received the human diplomatic team in his chambers on Thessaly Prime. His bioluminescence had faded to a dim glow, the exhaustion of the past weeks visible in every flicker. He had argued against the war from the beginning, but his voice had been drowned out by those eager for vengeance. Now those voices were silent, their owners dead or discredited. "I must ask," he said to the human ambassador, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chun, who was distantly related to the admiral. "Why are you being so merciful? Your people attacked us without provocation. We would be within our rights to demand much more." Dr. Chun smiled, and Frenkith noticed the exhaustion in her eyes as well. "Because we understand something that the Concord never learned," she said. "Victory through destruction is not truly victory. We could crush your civilization and take everything you have, but then we would become what we fought against. We would be conquerors, not liberators, and eventually someone would rise to defeat us, just as we defeated you." Threnkith considered this for a long moment. It was not the answer he had expected. Had assumed the humans would be drunk on their victory, eager to impose their will on the galaxy. Instead, they seemed almost reluctant to claim what they had won. "Your species is very strange," he said finally. "So we have been told." Dr. Chun replied the negotiations took 3 months. Every detail was argued over, every word scrutinized, every implication considered. The Kethfer hegemony initially refused to participate, their pride preventing them from accepting any treaty with the species that had humiliated them. But as it became clear that the coalition was offering genuine partnership rather than domination, even they began to soften. The final sticking point was the question of the coalition's member species, the Morthic. The Shen and the others who had thrown in their lot with humanity had all been subject peoples under Concord rule. The old order wanted them returned to their former status. The coalition refused to even discuss it. "These species chose to stand with us," Admiral Chun said in his only direct address to the negotiating committee. "They fought beside us. They bled with us. They are our allies and our friends. Any treaty that does not guarantee their freedom and dignity is not worth the paper it is printed on." The Concord representatives exchanged uneasy glances. They had never dealt with a power that valued its allies so highly. Most interstellar relationships were transactional at best, exploitative at worst. The idea that humans would sacrifice potential gains to protect species that had so recently been considered worthless was difficult to comprehend, but they had no leverage to push back. The coalition held military superiority, and everyone knew it in the end. The Treaty of Ganymede was signed on a moon orbiting the largest planet in the human home system. Representatives from every major species in the galaxy gathered to witness the moment. Ambassador Threnkith signed on behalf of the Veloria, new Kethver leader, chosen after a violent succession crisis. Signed for his people. The heads of the Morthic and Shen delegations wept openly as they added their marks. The first time in generations that their species had been treated as sovereign equals. Admiral Chun signed for the coalition, his face grave as he understood the weight of what he was committing his people to. This treaty ends one war, he said. But it begins something more important. It begins the process of building a galaxy where strength does not automatically mean dominion, where being powerful does not give you the right to exploit the weak. We have proven that we can fight. Now we must prove that we can build something worth fighting for. The chamber erupted in applause. But Chun did not smile. He knew that the real work was only beginning. Victory had been achieved through blood, and fire peace would require something far more difficult: trust, patience, and the willingness to see former enemies as potential friends. As he left the signing ceremony, Chun paused to look up at the stars. Somewhere out there, the galaxy was still full of dangers and challenges, but for the first time in human history, his species was no longer facing them alone, and that, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all. 5 years had passed since the Treaty of Ganymede, and the galaxy was transforming in ways that no one had predicted. The old order had not collapsed overnight. The Concord still existed in some form, though its power had been dramatically reduced. The great empires still commanded vast resources and billions of citizens, but the balance had shifted, and everyone could feel it. The Terran coalition had grown from 18 species to 47. Some joined because they had been oppressed under the old system and saw humanity as liberators. Others joined because they feared being left behind as the galaxy changed. A few joined simply because they were curious about the strange Deathworld species that had upended everything human. Worlds spread across dozens of star systems, not through conquest, as the Kethver had done, but through negotiation and partnership. They established colonies on worlds that other species considered too dangerous to settle. They built space stations in systems that had been written off as worthless. They found value in places that the Concord had ignored for millennia. They brought their allies with them. The Morthic were mining asteroids again, but now they did it for themselves rather than for colonial masters. The Shen had been given ocean worlds to settle, places where they could swim free for the first time in generations. Species that had been forgotten or marginalized under the old order found themselves with opportunities they had never imagined. It was not perfect. The transition was messy and difficult. Old grudges did not disappear simply because a treaty was signed. Kethver, in particular, struggled to accept their reduced status, and there were incidents along the border zones that threatened to reignite conflict, but the coalition held together, bound by something stronger than fear or self-interest. They were bound by the example that humanity set. A small agricultural world in what had once been Kethver territory. A human relief mission was distributing food and medicine to a species that had been starving under occupation. The Kethver had drained the soil and polluted the water during their centuries of rule, and the native Varith people had been reduced to subsistence farming on lands that could barely support them. Commander Maria Santos led the relief effort. She was a veteran of the war, scarred from a boarding action that had cost her an eye and left her with a permanent limp. She had every reason to hate the Kethver and everyone associated with them. Instead, she worked 18-hour days to feed beings who had never seen a human. Before the coalition arrived, a young Varith named Tefkal watched the human commander with a mixture of awe and confusion. His people had been conquered by the Kethver before he was born. He had grown up believing that all powerful species took what they wanted and discarded the weak. But here was this human, stronger than his greatest warriors, giving instead of taking. "Why do you help us?" he asked one day, as Santa supervised the delivery of a water purification system. "We have nothing to offer you. We cannot fight for you or work for you. We are broken." Santa's turned to look at him, her one remaining eye meeting his with an intensity that made him want to look away. "You think you have nothing to offer," she said, "but that is because you have been taught to see yourself through the eyes of conquerors. Every species has something unique. Every people has gifts that no one else possesses. The Kethver could not see that because they only valued strength. We see it because we have learned to look deeper. But even if you had nothing to offer," she continued, "we would still help you, because that is who we are. We protect those who cannot protect themselves. We remember what it was like to be alone and afraid, and we refuse to let others suffer, that when we have the power to help." Tethkol did not fully understand, but over the following months, as the human relief mission transformed his dying world into something that could sustain his people, he began to grasp what Commander Santos meant. The humans were not just strong, they were kind in a way that the galaxy had forgotten was possible. They gave freely and asked for nothing in return. They treated even the weakest and most broken species as equals, and slowly, one world at a time, they were reshaping the galaxy in their image, not through force, although they had proven they could fight when necessary, but through example, showing other species that there was another way to be powerful. News of the Varith relief mission spread across the coalition and beyond. It was not the only such mission, just one of hundreds that humanity was conducting across former conflict zones. But something about Commander Santos and her work captured the imagination of the galaxy. She was invited to speak before the Coalition Assembly, a rare honor for a military officer. The chamber was packed with representatives from dozens of species, all eager to hear from this human who had become a symbol of something new. Santos walked to the podium with her uneven gait, making no attempt to hide her scars or her disability. She looked out at the assembly, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried to every corner of the room. "They call us Deathworlders," she said. "They say we come from a world of violence and danger. They are not wrong. Our planet tried to kill us every day of our existence. We survived through strength and adaptability, and sheer stubborn refusal to die. But that is not all we learned. We also learned that no one survives alone, that the bonds between us are what give us strength. That compassion is not weakness, but the foundation of everything worth building. When you face death every day, you learn what truly matters. Not power for its own sake, not conquest, not domination. What matters is connection. What matters is leaving the universe a little better than you found it. What matters is being worthy of the lives you have been given." She paused, looking around the chamber. "We did not ask to be thrown into galactic politics," she said. "We did not want a war. But now that we are here, we intend to make something of it. Not an empire, not a conquest, something better. A galaxy where strength protects rather than oppresses, where every species can find their place, where the Deathworld myths become something to be proud of rather than feared." The assembly erupted in applause that lasted for nearly 10 minutes, and across the galaxy, beings of every species watched the broadcast and wondered if perhaps the universe was changing for the better. 20 years had passed since the first Kethver ship entered the Sol System. Ambassador Threnkith stood on the observation deck of a space station orbiting Earth, watching the blue and green planet turn slowly below him. He was old now. His bioluminescence faded to a soft glow that barely illuminated his features. Diplomatic career had spanned the most tumultuous period in galactic history, and he had witnessed changes that his younger self would have thought impossible. The station around him buzzed with activity from dozens of species. Human children ran through the corridors, chasing playmates from worlds that had been enemies a generation ago. Kethover merchants haggled with Morthic traders, while Shen scientists conferred with Valori researchers. The Barriers that had divided the galaxy for millennia were crumbling. Slowly but surely, a young human woman approached him, her uniform marking her as a diplomatic attaché, Ambassador Threnkith. She said with a respectful bow, "The memorial service is about to begin." "Thank you," he replied. "I will be there shortly." She hesitated, curiosity evident in her expression. "If you do not mind me asking, sir, why did you request permission to attend?" "Admiral Chun's family was surprised that you wanted to come." Threnkith's delight shifted to a shade of gentle melancholy. "Because he was my enemy," he said, "and then my adversary, and then my negotiating partner. And in the end, he became something I had never expected. He became my teacher, the memorial for Admiral James Chun was held in a garden on the shores of a lake near his childhood. Home thousands of beings had traveled from across the galaxy to pay their respects. Human politicians and military officers stood alongside alien ambassadors and coalition representatives. Chun's family sat in the front row, his children and grandchildren surrounded by friends who had become family. Ambassador Threnkith took his place among the dignitaries, his alien form drawing some surprised glances from the humans who had not expected him. The service was simple but moving. Speakers told stories of Chun's life, his childhood on a farm, his military career, his leadership during the war, his tireless work for peace in the years that followed. They spoke of a man who had been given every reason to hate but had chosen compassion instead, who had won a war and then dedicated himself to ensuring no such war would ever be necessary again. When the formal speeches ended, Threnkith was invited to say a few words. He had not prepared anything, but as he looked out at the gathering, he found that the words came easily. "I first learned of James Chen when he was an enemy commander," he said. "I saw recordings of his speeches and studied his tactics. I believed I understood him. A brilliant warrior, a dangerous opponent, a threat to everything my civilization held dear. I was wrong. I did not truly understand him until after the war, when he had every right to demand vengeance and instead offered peace, when he had the power to destroy us and chose to rebuild alongside us, when he showed me that strength is not measured by what you can take, but by what you choose to give." He paused, his light patterns shifting through colors that most humans could not interpret, but that his own species would recognize as profound emotion. The galaxy that existed before humanity arrived was ancient and stable and utterly stagnant. He continued, "We had achieved a kind of peace, but it was the peace of domination. The strong ruled the weak. Change was forbidden. Growth was discouraged, and we called it civilization. The humans showed us another way. They showed us that true strength is found in lifting others up rather than pressing them down. That the measure of a species is not how many worlds they conquer, but how many lives they improve. That fear can be transformed into fuel for something greater." James Chun embodied these lessons. He was a warrior who became a peacemaker, a leader who served rather than ruled, human who taught an entire galaxy what it means to be truly civilized. I am honored to have known him, and I am grateful that the universe brought our species together, even through conflict, because meeting humanity changed everything, changed the galaxy, changed me. Thank you. James Chun, rest well. Your legacy will endure as long as there are stars in the sky." As Threnkith returned to his seat, he noticed that many in the audience were weeping. Humans and aliens alike had been moved by his words. Chun's granddaughter, a young woman with her grandfather's sharp eyes, approached him after the service. "Thank you for what you said," she told him. "It meant a great deal to our family." "But may I ask you something?" Threnkith inclined his head. "Do you truly believe that we'd change the galaxy for the better?" She asked, or are we just another conqueror wearing a different mask? It was a profound question. The kind that kept diplomats awake at night. Threnix considered it carefully before answering. I have lived long enough to see many species claim to be different, he said. Most of them were lying. To others and to themselves. But your people are genuinely strange. You fight like demons and then weep over your fallen enemies. You build weapons capable of destroying worlds and then refuse to use them. You have every advantage. And yet you insist on sharing it with those who have nothing to offer in return. I do not pretend to understand you, but I have observed you for 20 years. And I believe that your strangeness might be exactly what the galaxy needed. Not conquerors, but catalysts. Not rulers, but examples. You showed us that there was another way to be powerful. Whether we have the wisdom to follow that example remains to be seen. But you gave us the chance, and for that, the galaxy will never forget the Deathworld species that refused to be what everyone expected them to be. The young woman smiled. And in that smile, Threnix saw echoes of her grandfather. He would have liked that answer, she said. He always said the hardest battles are the ones you fight against your own nature. He'd proved that every day. Threnix watched her walk away to rejoin her family. And he felt something he had not experienced since he was young. He felt hope. The galaxy was still dangerous. There would be more conflicts, more challenges, more darkness ahead. But humanity had shown that even in the darkest times, there was light to be found. They had come from a world that tried to kill them every day. They had survived through violence and determination and sheer stubborn refusal to die. And then they had taken all of that rage and pain and fear and transformed it into something beautiful. They had become protectors. Instead of predators, builders. Instead of destroyers, friends. Instead of conquerors, the Deathworld. Species had changed everything, and the galaxy would never be the same.